So can I please invite Kelly and Manjari and Mickey and Antoine to come to the podium. I don't know if there is yes, and then you can come later on. You have the bios of the speakers online on the website. Just to say that we're very delighted to have Mickey Chopra, who is at the World Bank, but he has a long history in the area of health. He used to be with UNICEF. He was also working for a long time in South Africa. And our colleague Manjari, who is Mahajan, who is associate professor in the graduate programs for international affairs at the New School, and who has worked for a long time on issues of science, technology, and health. I have learned a great deal from her. So this panel is on the expectations of this conference. And what we hope to achieve, discuss, I just want to say that the keynote from Philip, as well as the opening remarks by Caterini and Mary, I think have already highlighted some of the basic themes. Clearly, technology is not neutral. It has these positive and negative effects and so forth, and we want to have ethical use of technologies. But I think we need to go beyond that. I mean, first of all, and this is something that I learned from Manjari about 2 days ago in a classroom, where there is also a talk about these negative impacts in terms of the social consequences on individuals. We want to go beyond social consequences to individuals, to going upstream to how these technologies are being designed and utilized for what purpose. So the question of technology, for whom, by whom, and for whom, by whom, and well, the third one must be, for what? I think is the sort of the driving question, that it's not just the downstream effect on individuals, it's downstream effects on societies and social structures, but more fundamentally, what is the upstream driver of shaper of that technology, and who are the actors, what kind of finance, what kind of motivations, and therefore what kind of priorities. And I think this is one of the sort of fundamental motivations for this conference. And of course this is in the context of the mandate of the Independent Panel for Global Governance for Health, which highlighted the importance of understanding power structures in the sectors that are outside of the health sector, that is, sectors such as technology, technological development, that actually have tremendous consequences for health equity. So without any further commentary from me, I'd like to invite Manjari to give her remarks. Do you have a PowerPoint?
I don't.
No. And then for speakers, we have a timekeeper who will be giving you some warning signs.
Thank you very much, Sakiko. Let me add my welcome to hers to all of those who have come from outside the New School, in some case from across oceans and continents, from as far as India and South Africa. So we are very, very pleased that you all have joined us here. So, as you know, the charge from Sakiko for this panel was to outline some expectations of what we hope to discuss over the course of the next day and a half. And as I was thinking about my remarks, it just struck me that every few years there is a wave of excitement about some new technology that might soon reshape the world. So there are articles, workshops, conferences that highlight the revolutionary potential of the emerging technology of the day. So it used to be biotechnology, then it was nanotechnology, then it's information technology, mobile technology. These days it's about digital technologies, AI, and big data. So financial speculation, entrepreneurial enthusiasm, nationalist discourses jockey in this dynamic space where, ironically, the claims very often about the emerging technologies are difficult to verify. The breathless enthusiasm about these new technologies is also accompanied typically by a discourse of concern about risks and problems. And eventually this debate about promise and perils subsides, where the emerging becomes extant, the uncertain becomes common sense. So today, the discussion is very much about the revolutionary and profound consequences of digital technologies. Those of us who work on questions of big data, AI, are constantly struck, as we heard from the keynote speaker, about the far-reaching consequences of these new technologies. And yet, as a student of technologies, I feel as though as far-reaching as these impacts are, we have in some ways been here before. So I want to use the few minutes that I have actually not to directly talk about digital technologies, but actually talk about our history and experiences in trying to govern an older technology, namely biotechnology, and what that experience might tell us in terms of the challenges we might face in trying to regulate and govern digital technologies. And my aim here is not to draw simple equivalences between the old and the new, because obviously there are dramatic differences. And yet I think there is a role for history to guide us in some ways. So not many years ago, enthusiasts claimed that biotechnology would completely transform agriculture, medicine, environmental problems, producing radical improvements in human health and environmental sustainability. Simultaneously, biotechnology also encountered intense opposition, with critics warning of unanticipated consequences, but also how the very meaning of life would fundamentally be changed as cells, genes, and much more would come under technological control. As different scholars have pointed out, in the early days, the regulation of biotechnology, especially in countries like the United States, produced a particular paradox. While claiming its transformative potential, protagonists, whether states or corporations or scientists, characterized biotechnology as a singular, well-delineated site with a distinctive means of production. Yet, when it came to matters of regulation, biotechnology was not necessarily treated as a revolutionary technology that demanded corresponding transformative shifts in policy apparatus. Instead, its control and regulation were mainly slotted into existing bureaucratic frameworks. So at the most basic level, policy frameworks, especially in this country, but really this was mimicked in many countries around the world, like India, Brazil, Argentina, divided biotechnology innovations into pharmaceutical products and agricultural products, the former related to human health and the latter to crops, animals, and farmers. There were established government ministries and bureaucracies that could deal with this kind of a classification. There were established modes of expertise and ethics that could deal with this kind of classification. It made common sense that regulating biotechnology should follow the logics of pre-existing sectors of bureaucratic competence and expertise. So as I've mentioned, this bureaucratic arrangement was most explicitly institutionalized in the United States, and these regulatory choices ended up being very consequential, in part because they affected the degree and style in which societies could deliberate on the underlying purposes of innovation. So So for example, agricultural biotechnology goes under the Department of Agriculture, where really the guiding logics and concerns are about production, efficiency, agricultural subsidies, and a whole other understanding of risk, namely environmental risk, kind of falls off the radar and doesn't get measured and surveilled as much. So this leads to the first point that I want to note about expectations from the conference, which is that in talking about governance of a new technology, there is always the risk that our discourse and then the practice about management of the new ends up being slotted into prior bureaucratic traditions, institutions, and legal arrangements. And these are arrangements whose role and remit have been molded previously by concerns for very different matters. So, a concern with privacy, for instance, that overwhelms discussion of AI and big data. At this conference, I feel our challenge will be to examine how the governance of new digital technologies may demand using some existing institutional arrangements, but also determining how we can build new types of formal and informal institutional capacities that speak to the new particular characteristics of the digital. Moreover, the politics of knowledge production and technology regulation has typically played out in national settings. And this national domain, as we heard from the keynote speaker, remains extremely salient today, and yet we are also increasingly in a global arena with new technologies and their purveyors, large corporations, that are particularly disrespectful of national boundaries. So our challenge, it seems to me, will also be about what comparable processes for regulation can we conceptualize, institutionalize, talk about on the global stage. What would be the preconditions of credibility of rule makers on a worldwide scale? Coming back to biotech. So after the initial few years, biotechnology also came to be marked as a realm where claims of both states and large corporations were increasingly met with enormous public distrust in many countries. So most prominently in countries like the United Kingdom and in Europe, but this was really a trend that was seen in countries in Latin America, in countries in Asia. So for instance, in the United Kingdom, successive controversies, whether it be around mad cow disease or GMOs, led to large sections of the British public massively questioning these technologies. And it really produced a kind of crisis of confidence in the institutions of the state, but also in broader scientific expertise. And what this triggers is actually quite productive in that it triggers a series of experiments, especially in Europe, but not exclusively, with different forms of public participation and governance. So what we see in the 90s and in the early 2000s is a range of deliberative exercises, such as citizen juries, consensus conferences, public referenda in Britain, but also in France, Denmark, India, Japan, Switzerland. Not all of these exercises in public participation were constituted by the government. Indeed, the politics of biotechnology in Europe in the 90s offers a prime example of environmentalists, consumers, activists, farmers organizing outside the remit of the state and refusing to accept that corporations should have complete leeway in determining the course of technological innovation. Some of this activism has been dubbed as a new Luddism in opposition to technology, and yet it might be useful to also think of these as experiments in deliberative democracy, where technical expertise, especially when residing in corporations, has to justify itself and make its case publicly. So in biotech policy, this has been sometimes been dubbed as the participatory turn. The question for us here, I think, would be, what would a participatory turn in the digital era look like? What would be the structured processes for deliberating and reflecting on digital technologies, especially in a culturally heterogeneous global public sphere? To take the cue from the history of biotech, the task would be not only to engage publics, but literally to elicit and produce educated publics for sophisticated debates. It would involve creating publics where citizens are not merely a source of data, but also agents who can bear on the questions at hand. This would involve formal mechanisms for participation, but also an intellectual and democratic milieu which respects and engages with citizens of different sorts. Back to the history. So controversies in biotech, such as over genetically modified foods, stem cell research, clinical trials of new research, new drugs, produced a burst of activity on ethics in science. So for instance, research programs on ethical, legal, social implications, and this is often dubbed as ELSI, were launched in the wake of the Human Genome Project in this country, and ethics committees were introduced in several institutional and policy contexts. And this was seen as kind of, being responsive to the concerns that were being voiced about the new technologies. Over time, though, there was a growing critique of these ethics committees and LC initiatives. They were regarded as window dressing, legitimation instruments that allowed scientists to do their work while at the same time reassuring publics that normative issues had been considered. It was argued that in reality, these LC initiatives were under-resourced with little power and typically brought in at the end of innovative process to discuss social impact. Ethics, critics argued, had become the handmaiden of biotech enthusiasts. Moreover, critics pointed out, and we heard a bit of this earlier from Philip Alston, that the ethics discourse drew upon long-standing traditions of bioethics, which as a discipline has a particular genealogy of having been developed in medical schools in the United States and really focusing on certain kinds of questions of individual choice and consent. This ethics discourse does not have a capacity, or did not, to consider the range of structural causes, distributional inequities, or social consequences of the new technologies. So this brings me to the third question and expectation from the conference. Should we give so much space to an ethical discourse around AI, big data? What might be alternative ways of considering questions of morality, law, political economy, and social concerns? Might there be a language of public policy, regulation, democratic deliberation that might be more capacious than that of ethics? If we do use a language of ethics, how can it be explicitly be made more capacious to include questions of distribution and equity? Moreover, how can we ensure that these concerns are introduced in upstream stages of innovation, where they can shape the goals and intent of technology production, and where they can restore to the field of governance normative questions that have been relegated to the sidelines in the celebration of technology? Last point. One of the features of the revolutionary rhetoric around many new technologies is that it suggests that the technology in itself drives social and economic transformation. And yet historians and sociologists of technology have long shown that technologies always work in concert with a variety of different social institutions. So for instance, the emergence of biotechnology in American universities produced a slew of new institutional arrangements. There was an active effort to link academic research to the private sector, leading to new laws that facilitated novel academic industry alliances, new rules for intellectual property protection, and creation, a real proliferation of technology transfer offices in universities. A wave of startups were founded by venture capitalists and university professors. These were new hybrids of public and private, academic and industry, basic and applied, leading to what has been called academic capitalism. It required that the governance of biotechnology involved not only the examination of a particular technique, such as gene editing, but for the governance to be meaningful in any ways, it would have to de facto also be about examination of the range of actors that form the ecology around gene editing. So this raises the final point that I want to raise of how the work of governance of digital technologies cannot be confined to dealing with something as discrete as algorithms of Facebook or Twitter or YouTube advertisements. Rather, it will have to demand a cognizance, but also regulation of a far broader set of actors and dynamics in which the technology is embedded. So I'll conclude here. I've tried to suggest that the history and experiences with biotechnology point to challenges that governance of digital technologies will also encounter. Building of institutions that don't immediately fall into the trap of following existing grooves, building mechanisms of participation that might involve creating informed publics, building a normative discourse of social, legal, and political concerns that is capacious and not captured only by ethics talk that focuses on questions of individual privacy and safety, and frames of analysis that take as their subject not discrete technologies, but entire ecologies of actors and relations that the technologies are embedded in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you have a PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you in particular to Sakiko and to Katerina for the invitation. My task this morning is really to talk about what keeps me up at night in terms of the situation where the recent global monitoring report showing over 1 billion people still not have access to basic health services, that more people than ever before are going into poverty because of payments to get access and to pay for health services. And so how do we make health and basic health coverage available for the poorest and effective and affordable for the poorest? And not only that, how do we look at the, sorry, it's different here than what's up there. How do we also change the way in which services are delivered? So the focus now much more on primary health care, on the shift from the tyranny of the doctors and the health workers to empowering communities and users of health services. And for sure, the role of innovation is playing an increasing role in this discourse and in our work as well in the bank, where we are we have $16 billion worth of grants and subsidized loans to countries on making health services available. And so we are looking at a diversity of innovations, ranging from looking at how these technologies and innovations can change how service delivery is done, so moving from hospital and clinic-centric to more community-based, looking at efficiencies that point-of-care diagnostics can now bring as well, so we don't need so many infrastructures such as laboratories, but also what are the opportunities and challenges of mHealth, artificial intelligence, as well as the delivery innovations, in particular, what are the opportunities and challenges, as we've just said, around behavioral economics and these kinds of things. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is just give you a flavor of some of the areas in which we in the bank are trying to maximize and where we are already seeing in the field quite interesting and exciting, I think, manifestations of some of these opportunities, but also then what are the constraints, and in particular the issues that you're going to be discussing in the next 2 days, how they are not only slowing down these technologies and opportunities reaching the poorest, but in some cases also paralyzing processes in countries as well, so that the poorest are not getting the access, but whereas the market failures of the private sector, as Philip Alston said, there's no incentive for them to go in and serve these populations, and so the middle classes and the better off are actually benefiting even more. So inequalities are growing. So I'll just start with some basic overview of the field. From a global health perspective, we are seeing some of these trends. I'm not going to go into these. I know other talkers and speakers in the conference will touch upon this a little bit more. But even in the poorest countries, so I was just with the team from Somalia, where 95% of the country has 3G mobile coverage, 90% of households have access to mobile phones, and of those, about 70% are smartphones. So even in the most poorest context, the rapid spread of mobile technology, for example, is real and is getting more and more penetrative as well. There are still some issues of gender and age issue and class differences, of course, but what is quite remarkable in some of the countries that I've been working in is how quickly these things are also changing and shifting. And the global institutions such as UNICEF and WHO and others in the bank as well are working on trying to establish some of these ethical and regulatory principles and processes. So this is an ongoing effort, and I'm sure we'll be discussing how sufficient or insufficient these efforts are. But just to point out that it is a process going on. Now, in our work, one of the things we're trying to focus in on is what are the priorities, what are the constraints that the poorest, particularly the poorest households and women and children are facing in particular, and what role can these innovations play. So this may not come across very clearly, but just to give you a sense of starting to map out the key bottlenecks or constraints from the household, the female, the women, going all the way out into the communities, and then looking at some of the service delivery. So what we've been doing is mapping the common constraints that we're seeing, or encouraging and working with countries and NGOs and others to prioritize the challenges for healthcare delivery and demand side, and then trying to crowd in innovations, not just digital and technological, but it could be organizational and financial as well. So what I want to do is just give you a flavor of some of those opportunities. I won't spend too long so that we have to catch up on our time. Just to give you some examples of what's happening out there, and that at least that we're involved in. So one is this task shifting and focus on much more getting community-based workers to be able to become more formally part of the healthcare system, so getting them salaried and recognized as a formal part of the healthcare system, and then making sure that they're connected and working in a professional manner as well, with support as well. So mobile phones has been a critical part of that process. This is an example from India where over 350,000 health workers now are working and reaching out and doing home visits and community meetings with software on their mobile phones, which guides them through how to, guides them through a consultation with a household. There's applications around nutrition, weighing and measuring kids, and what to do when the kid is not growing or not gaining weight, and so forth. In Sierra Leone, we've now something like 15,000 community workers in Sierra Leone are all now getting e-payments so when they do visits or when they submit reports, they then get reimbursed for their time and efforts and so forth. So what we're finding is in very challenging circumstances that we can now start to train and get increased access to at least basic services through community-based workers, and be able to help them not feel so isolated and feel part of a bigger system through the use of such things as sort of mobile technology. Something that in South Africa, particularly with the previous minister, was a big part of his legacy, has been a program called Mum Connect, where women who are pregnant and get registered at their health center for a free WhatsApp or SMS-based system where they can both receive messages to remind them for appointments or to remind them about taking particular supplements, but also where they can also call or SMS in with any, it's a hotline, 24/7 hotline for any questions or concerns that they may have. It has been very successful in terms of over 2 million women have been connected. Nearly all health facilities that see antenatal women are offering the service to sign women up. What's also been interesting is that the response rate to questions around what kind of services they've received has been relatively high at 60% and growing. So it's also providing some feedback in terms of quality of care and perceptions of quality of care from these women. So it's also a way for them to also start to give some feedback into the system as well. My penultimate example is in Rwanda, where well, it's said it's an AI, but it's not really AI. It's basically just simple algorithmic clinical protocols which are now being put onto a system which is allowing people to either directly or through their local clinic have access to doctors who can now, so you can now have access to medical advice without necessarily having to go to the town or city and see and find a highly skilled health worker. So it's basically a mobile phone-based telemedicine type of operation, which is now spreading very quickly, even in a place like Rwanda. And then finally, an example that UNICEF has developed, and we're picking up with them as well now, is where in many countries, youth have been given access to a free sort of WhatsApp, SMS-based platform to communicate and free texts and messages. So it's like a social platform, but it has also been used to to do basically rapid surveys. So for example, when the school year starts, to just say, have the school books arrived in your school, and that generates reports at the district level of some of the services and the quality of services, as well as doing other kinds of survey questions as well. One final example of the use of big data, and I know it's got a challenging area. One way in which we've used this is an example from South Africa, where in many countries what you have is very fragmented information systems. So it's very difficult to actually make much sense of the information and data that's out there for policy making or management. So here's an example where we took the laboratory information systems, which are often not connected to the patient information systems, so it's difficult to know and to be able to have a sense of whether patients have taken drugs and whether they're virally suppressed, for example. So in this case, we were able to work with some of the data scientists through some fuzzy logic, to connect records based on characteristics of those records, and then generate clinic by clinic, but also give to policymakers districts where patients who are on treatment are actually being suppressed versus those on treatment who are not being, the viral load is not being suppressed. So it gives you a very detailed sense of the quality of the performance of the facilities and districts across the country, and then to guide where further support and intensive care is required. So those are some of the opportunities of where, trying to reach to the poorest populations, trying to work to both empower users to be able to give feedback, as well as then to empower frontline workers to do better care and diagnostics. We are facing a number of challenges in scaling this up and making this more a more common feature of health services. Partly it's due to specific financing and capacity gaps. Here's just a few examples of some of the challenges we're facing in terms of being able to persuade governments to put resources into investing in these kinds of approaches, particularly in the poorest communities. Ranging from a real challenge of for the developers of these technologies, that they don't have a sense that there is a market here, and that the challenge for them is understanding how to access government resources, and the term of governments as well, that they just don't trust and can't figure out many cases of how to engage in contracting in a way which is fair, and they feel they're getting value for money. So on both sides, there's a massive gap in terms of capacity and trust, and also just some of the legal and contractual issues. So it means that some of these technologies are not, there is a barrier to getting them because the market itself is not going to solve that. But more fundamentally, the uncertainty around the issues that you're going to be discussing this next 2 days around privacy, around the potential for the use of or the misuse of data and databases, means that it's a bit of a wild west out there. So there are no strong very few countries are regulating the development of applications. So companies are going in, collecting data from patients, and there are very weak controls in terms of who gets access and how that is used. But furthermore, it's leading to a misalignment then of some of the potential uses. So, for example, that the information and data that we have on, say, particularly health and well-being of the poorest is not something which is collected routinely and being able to process. So therefore, they're not benefiting from any potential development of new clinical algorithms for treatment, for the conditions that they are facing in particular. So they're not getting any benefits from, say, more efficient ways of doing lab diagnostics or radiology and so forth. And some of the deeper structural inequalities, are being reproduced. So some of the issues around gender, that we've got to make sure that if we are relying on feedback from the use of mobile phones, that the issue of control and ownership and access to these kinds of technologies, even though it's changing, nonetheless there still are some fundamental differences. So we must be careful in terms of how far we go and how quickly we go with this. So I'll just stop there just to give you a sense of some of the opportunities we see, but also some of the constraints, and particularly getting to the poorest. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Manjari and Mickey. I think that Kelly is on her way, but she's been delayed, so I think we will proceed, and I think when she comes, we will give her an opportunity to speak later in the program. So Antoine is a researcher at SUM, University of Oslo, and he has been the pillar of the independent panel for the last 2 years, keeping us all together on working on these issues of global governance for health. And he's I think thought a lot about these issues. So in a holistic way. So we'd like to hear about your kind of reactions to these 2 presentations, so please.
Yes, and thank you. I had a look at the presentation from Kelly Lee, and I was going to start my reactions on that, but I will anyway. I think one of her points, and hopefully we'll hear that from her later, is that these new technologies are leading us to a lack of control. We don't really understand what's going on. And it's very paradoxical, because on the one hand, they provide us a control that we never had. All this data we have, all these tools we have that help us for the decision making, for controlling the population, as Philip Alston said earlier. In a way, it could also be seen as a kind of a hygienist utopia, where these new technologies really help us achieve this ideal society of healthy individuals controlled by a paternalistic state, to achieve the best health outcome. We have control also because they help us think about the future in a very positive way, or at least the mainstream discourse provides us. They help us stay in uncertainty. They'll help us get control over a planet that we don't really control anymore. There are so many crises around there. They provide kind of a hope that we might overcome them. But on the other hand, and that's a paradox, their complexity is kind of their weakness too, because no one really understands what's going on in a holistic matter. When we ask people, how was this algorithm, how does it work? It's really hard for people to explain that. There are a lot of assumptions that are embedded, a lot of guesstimates, a lot of made-up things that are embedded in these technologies that needs to be maybe highlighted and be made clearer. And that has very interesting effects on the policy and the governance of it, the hope and the uncertainty. I think a concept that can help us think of all of this is the concept of risk. Risk, as we all know in the common language, is this negative aspects of we don't know what's going on and there might be a threat. But as Miki Chopra reminded us, risk in finance is also something very positive. Risk leads to rewards. Risk leads to gain and profit. And we need to, I think, maybe be more explicit in our thinking of these things as both risk and both positive and negative. And I see Kelly Lee is arriving, but I'll just keep going. Risk is also, as Ulrich Beck pointed out, risk can be created by these new modern technologies that get out of our control. And I go back to what we were thinking, and that they cannot be insurable. Their damage might be not repairable. And I think that's very important to take a break and think about this before we move forward. Can we really move forward without having control about consequences that might be tremendous? Another point that I think is very important to highlight is this idea of dependency on technologies. The actors who create this technology make us dependent on them. And that has tremendous consequences upstream and downstream. Policymakers are dependent on big data to make their policy decisions nowadays. We are dependent on our phone to have GPS and to orient ourselves. Doctors are now dependent on CT scans and a lot of tools to proceed with their examinations and kind of maybe neglect for some of them the clinical aspects of it. So what happens when energy upon which this technology thrives is gone? What happens when, in poor countries context, when there is no electricity or it's not there all the time? What happens in times of climate breakdown where we need to cut our energy consumptions? We increasingly rely on these technologies that are dependent on these energies. What I expect from this conference, and I will finish there, is maybe to learn more about how to study these things. It's a new field, and studying it critically will require different methodology, maybe some courage to go beyond the lack of control and the difficulty of the complexity. But maybe could you reflect a little bit about how is it different as well? What is so special about these technologies? Because they're already there, and there are a lot more there than this biotech when they were created. So is it already too late? Or maybe we could start with this. But it's a growing field, it's terribly exciting, and I think we have a great conference ahead of us. Thank you.
Any questions, remarks, comments on these issues? Anybody? Yes, Michael, yes. But please, anybody with questions, please line up at the microphone, please, and introduce yourself. Okay.
Good morning. Thank you all for the presentations today. I wanted to ask for your thoughts on something that Philip noted earlier in terms of the idea of of being captured by the neoliberal agenda. As we think about the lessons learned, particularly from the many conversations and both the good and the bad that came during the biotechnological revolution, how do we, as we think about digital technology, artificial intelligence, and given the reality of the current dependence on the private sector where most of this technology is coming from, how do we avoid continuing to be captured by the neoliberal agenda? And I'm also curious about Mickey's perspective on this, given that the bank itself has gone through quite the evolution over the past 30 years, and particularly in response to criticism about its exclusive focus on the neoliberal agenda. So how can we move forward, think about how we want to regulate this very new space without being captured by some previous thoughts that have clearly shown to have some destructive elements?
Thank you. Maybe I'll just abuse my role here, just to add to Michael's question, say, how do you see the role of the public sector in financing development?
Yeah, thank you very much. Cornelia, I think my question falls very much into the same domain. Right now we're expecting the old to create something new, but existing paradigms, existing mindsets, existing structures are likely to produce more of the same. So I was wondering to which extent you have seen tendencies or fora where something radically new has actually a chance to arise. So something which maybe brings together all the necessary sectors, be it academics, private sector, development workers, like really bringing it all that could together create something new. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Holly Crowley. I'm a visiting fellow at NYU. I was particularly interested by the Babel example you gave. So in a previous job, I ran the evaluation of Babylon for the NHS. And as the NHS, we really struggled to understand the motivations of Babylon as a company and to hold them to account, to get their data, to understand what they were doing and why they were doing it. What hope do you have that the Rwandan government can do that, and what risks might there be?
Hi, I'm Marine Aldada. I'm a French researcher from the national agency, the CNRS. I think there is one thing that Manjari talked about, and that's important. I think the role of social sciences and research in this perspective is to deconstruct all the promises around innovation, and maybe not to focus on innovation itself and the innovative power of digital health. I think the example that you gave on digital health is very demonstrative of this hope bubble around the program you have been showing. For instance, the ICDS in India. I think they are very old problems that have been there for many years, focusing only on the digital part that is happening today. I think is a narrow choice that we really have to avoid as a researcher and as scholars. I will be very happy to discuss in those coming 2 days about focusing not only on the technological components, but what are those programs made of, and they were here before the digital age, and what are we trying to make of them today because of the digital agenda. I would really like you to talk more about this, about the fact that the digital tools is nothing in the middle of this big hope around improving health access, for instance, in the Global South.
I'm Rajiv from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Thank you, panel, for the wonderful talk. My question is specifically to Manjari, a very thought-provoking presentation. So as you gave the context of biotechnologies and the whole importance of ethics, morality, so if we put bio-technology, and if we go deeper in the history, so there has been a whole history of biology shaping disciplines, economics, systems theory, the whole cybernetics group in MIT. So now, how do you see the recoming of biology in digital biotechnologies and having that historical influence in shaping those things? Because biology has been always present in technology. So yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Erickson from the Faculty of Health Sciences. Hey, Kelly. Glad you got here. I just wanted to make the point, because I too often heard in this panel that we don't actually know how people are using technologies, that there are decades and decades of social science work that is often ignored in the public policy and certainly the global health sphere, whether it's coming from anthropology departments or sociology departments, geography departments, or science and technology departments. There is so much work on how technologies are being used by people on the ground, whether it's doctors or patients or midwives, or there's a lot of data that just does not tend to make it into the public sphere. And so, Manjari, you yourself are doing some of the most amazing research, so I know that you're aware of it, but let's not get caught up in the we don't actually know how this technology is being used or what the effects are, because in fact we do, but it tends to be that the anthropologists, because they introduce nuance and a lot of messiness, tend not to get invited to public venues like this.
Yes. Is this the final question, comment? Anybody else? No? Okay, this is it.
Okay, Daisy Flores, I work in health and safety issues. So I was wondering, this question is from Manjari. She was talking about how we move from the past to the future and present issues. So I was wondering how it works in the context that we have so many countries that right now they see health as a benefit and not as a right anymore, and what are the challenges of that? And also that is connected to technology, because I'm fascinated about technology, and I've been attending to so many events regarding to health and technology, and sometimes I see that the participants, they see health as a niche, as an opportunity to build business. And the approach is just to make profits and not necessarily to understand the health problems in general and how to find the right solutions for that, because they are just thinking in business. So as we are moving forward to work like in this multidisciplinary kind of field, like working between academia, private sector, and all experts also, what are your perspectives about it and how it's going to work in terms of the regulations and the risks? And my last question is for the speaker from the World Bank. I know that it's very expensive to collect data as well and to build those kind of systems that gave you the opportunity to show us this kind of like great perspectives about some specific challenges and outcomes as well. But how can we transfer that to just communities and poor countries and especially organizations that they don't have the money for that, invest so much in just collecting data? And what is the point about collecting just data when sometimes you're not able just to use that data in the best way because you don't understand that, or because the people that have to use it, they are not ready for just use that technology, as you've mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the very last
Thank you for your indulgence. Judith Rios from UNDP. I guess this is a question for Dr. Chopra. I mean, some of the technologies that you show are already being in use are highly linked to the biotechnological sector in terms of being used to facilitate access or to medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics. When you talk about challenges and opportunities for data analytics, you mostly focus on the privacy, on the personal, individual data analytics. I wanted to get your thoughts on data analytics that are more systematic. So as these, more systemic, as these technologies are being used to collect and to generate data on market dynamics, on consumption of pharmaceuticals, on future demands of pharmaceuticals, as well as also on lack of access to these pharmaceuticals. And these technologies and these data are being linked to pharmaceutical companies, some of them with higher control of a market. What safeguards need to be created on this data analytics to ensure that this information is going to be used in a more systemic way, not to create undue competition or undue barriers to competition, as well as, for example, on antimicrobial resistance, to ensure that the balance between access and access to health technologies is going to be tipped into the direction of the public interest, ensuring that the right balance is approached. So I guess my question is very general about data analytics that are safeguards for more systemic interventions as we link digital technologies, artificial intelligence, and the biopharmaceutical sector.
Good. Well, wonderful set of questions. So, who wants to go first? Manjari? we go in the same order?
Sure. So there are many questions, and I know we are running behind, so maybe what I'll do is combine a few of these questions to just say briefly that in terms of the way ahead, not, I think that's what the conference is about, we have to think about mechanisms and structures for regulation, but also reflection and analysis of digital technologies that take place not only within the state, but also have a whole range of different experts and citizens at the table. And I think what is absolutely key is the kind of questions that get asked, where instead of saying, we have this technology, mobile phones, and does it work in delivering text messages that might help maternal, pregnant women keep their appointments? Somewhere I think that we have to kind of dial back a bit and ask a slightly different sort of question, where it should be about, as Marine and others have said, what are the old, persistent, systemic problems that we are contending with? Start with that as the starting point, and then see how technologies can be developed, sometimes anew, to try and address those questions, rather than starting with apps that have been produced by a variety of different companies and Silicon Valley and Bangalore innovators, and then see how these apps can be refashioned, repurposed. And the process of coming up with these questions, I feel, has to involve a range of different experts, and it can't just be people like us. It has to also be state bureaucrats and the people who are the supposed subjects of these improvement projects.
Yeah, I think the challenge of the reality of the hollowing out of the state over a period of time in the context of the neoliberal sort of policies is manifesting in what I'm seeing, which is that you have this issue that there is sort of anarchy out there, and the rise of philanthropy as well. So there are thousands of examples of where well-meaning groups have gone in with an application or with a brand new idea, and they try it out and they show how great it is, and then pitch it to either governments or ministries or other even larger donors to put it into their programs. And as a result, you have this sort of huge fragmentation of many different information systems, many different ecosystems, and often a state and a ministry which has very little control and management, let alone access to this data. So that is the manifestation of many of the issues that have been raised this morning already. So I suppose, our challenge in the bank is how do we work with the state to try and make sense and get on top of this, and then also at the same time have that equity lens of starting with for the poorest and those who need it the most. And I think Babel is an example of one of these challenges of where it is a technology and an approach which has huge potential, but also, as we've seen even in the UK, with its relatively stronger capacity, has grappled with both the understanding how the algorithms have been generated and the technology there, but also then safety and so forth. And so, we have been working with the government of Rwanda to say, well, we shouldn't. It is a potential here, but how do we use this as a way both to so we are taking in a stepwise manner with them to say, okay, let's start with a relatively smaller universe of. We started with their own civil servants and their own internal insurance system, but it is then about building capacity of the state to understand both the potential but the challenges of such technologies and approaches, both in terms of the risk but also in terms of the contracting and the legal and so forth. So it is so I think the opportunity, it is very much to turn this on its head and say, well, we do need to start from a user design perspective, or what is it that the the challenges and the problems that the people who we should be at the front of the queue are facing at the moment in accessing high-quality health services, and then what is the potential to reimagine how that care pathway may now be done with all these new opportunities and potential that's out there. So I do think it's not very glamorous, but it is about a lot of our time is about how do we build critical capacities in the state to be able to navigate and steward this new terrain without being paralyzed from both sides in terms of, well, the issues of the complexity of this new technology, the issues of how these algorithms are generated, the issues of privacy are just too big for us to, even the UK NHS has not been able to manage it completely, and therefore what hope would we have, and then to leave it to the private sector to muddle its way through and increase complexity. So that's the reason, one of the reasons I'm here and I'll be listening very contently is really what do we have to offer particularly for governments and ministries that is not so overwhelming and doesn't lead to paralysis, but does give them the hope and the idea that, look, even with our restrained resources, we can provide services which are of good quality to the poorest without having to build hundreds of new clinics or hospitals necessarily, though they will have to do some of that, within the constraints and capacities that we have.
Antoine?
Yes. Just a couple of words to say that maybe one of the key issues we haven't mentioned in this session will be to identify advocacy coalition. Because it's not only about state capacity, it's also about citizens and advocacy and civil society. And as we mentioned, these issues are highly complex. So maybe we can learn also from history, how did advocacy coalition formed to push these technologies towards the vulnerable and serving the interest of everyone for highly complex topic. And we need to look at this and be wary that the forces and the power asymmetries in the field are huge. And you just mentioned philanthropies, and this philanthropies also fund a lot of civil society who are dependent on this funding and who apply to develop these new technologies, and will not be able to critically challenge these efforts.
Kelly, would you like to, do you have any commentary on anything that you've heard so far? It's bearing in mind that we will hear more properly from Kelly tomorrow.
Thank you for that opportunity. I've obviously missed a really, really rich and interesting conversation. I think a couple of things. I guess my talk was, if I had given it, would have been about control and power asymmetries. And I think, we're picking up these themes already in this session. And so what do we do about it? We know there are very deep power asymmetries and the lack of control by the public sector in these technologies. And I'm going to talk about two things, I guess, which link to some of the comments that have been made. And one is that one of the areas of hope, I suppose, is that there's a recognition of the contradictions of neoliberalism, and that that recognition is not beyond high-tech giants, that they're seeing the unsustainability of what is happening in terms of political, economic, and environmental sustainability. There's so much polarization and so on, so much inequality, that those things are not sustainable. And for those high-tech giants, that is a threat to their well-being. So finding some policies that create goal congruence, I call it, or some commonality there, might be some hope there to turn it around. And the second thing is these technologies could provide ways of disrupting or be transformative in themselves, that these groups that will come together, that need to come together from the public sphere, from civil society, from individuals, could be facilitated by these technologies. We're already seeing this, and I think there in itself is some hope there for changing things.
This has been really fascinating, and I think it's raised a number of really important issues about how we can learn from the history of older technologies, about some of the realities of efforts on the ground. But, thinking about all of these things together, and particularly with Kelly reminding us that we live in this context of power asymmetries, we can also learn from older technologies about the role of the public sector, the role of the private sector, the role of the civil society and the philanthropies, and go beyond thinking about the public sector as sort of passive recipients of technologies being developed in the private sector for profit, for private sector purposes in the area of access to medicines, for example. All of the talk now is about how to reshape the financing of public priority medicines and interventions and other technologies, and recognizing that the private sector interests, priorities are not aligned with public priorities. I mean, that's something that we learned since decades ago in the debates about access to medicines. And so what is the role of the public sector in setting priorities, going beyond just sort of saying, oh, this is a good thing, but going beyond regulations, but really not going beyond regulations, which is sort of like an upstream, a downstream thing, but actually more proactively thinking about priorities and finding mechanisms of financing that are not dependent on market incentives, because we know that in the medical field, in the health sector, that technologies developed on the basis of market incentives do not align with global public priorities. I mean, that's really a sort of a fundamental understanding that we've acquired over the last 30 years. So this has been a tremendously rich morning, and I think we need a break. So we'll just have a short break.